Welcome, everyone, to Ecopsychology Voices, an interview series with some of ecopsychology's luminaries. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this series. Linda Bazal and I co-created this program. Today, Gabrielle Milanich will be interviewing Brian Stafford. Gabrielle and Brian, thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom with us today. And Gabrielle, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning here in the United States, or it's also kind of afternoon, I suppose. So I'll just say good day. So I'm here with Brian Stafford, and in Brian's past life, he was trained as medical pediatrician and psychiatry. But in his current life, he's doing things a little bit differently now. So he's co-developed the Wild Mind Training Program with Bill Plotkin, whom I'm sure many of you have heard of. In addition, he's gone on to start Wilderness is Medicine and co-founded the Seminary of the Wild and the California Teachers College, which is a nature-based and soul-inspired teachers college. Brian will define here in our session here the terms eco-awakening, and he'll also describe how Bill Plotkin created a model and praxis for facilitating eco-awakening. Brian's also going to discuss some of the tools used with AVI, which is Animas Valley Institute, and how it describes the Wild Mind Training Program, and he'll also share some initial forays into broader dissemination of this type of ecotherapy. So Brian, I'm so thrilled to be able to talk with you because there's a couple of major themes of your interest here that I think are so timely. But let me just ask, just kind of jump in, and can you give us kind of an overview of what you mean by eco-awakening? And you also use the terms ego logic and eco logic, and I'm wondering if you can just kind of give us a background of that.
Sure. Seems like a good place to start. Thanks for having me here. I'm currently in Denver, Colorado, the land tended by the Ute and the Arapaho in ages gone past and still. And I live in Southern California, but I'm back home, actually. And it's pertinent to this conversation because I belong to the Rocky Mountains in a certain way. When I was a child, I was fortunate enough to have a father who loved going into the Rocky Mountains. And he actually built us a cabin, actually, outside of Winter Park, Colorado. So I was very fortunate to have maybe, I don't know, I'd say 3 weekends a month in the summer to run wild in the forest, actually. And several weekends in the winter to cross-country ski and to snowshoe and to sled and do all those kind of fun things and kind of get out of the city. And I'd say in some ways that saved my life, to be honest with you, and helped direct my life. I feel like each of us is called to bring a unique gift to the world, but most of us rarely find it. And one of the reasons we rarely find it is because we don't know where we belong. Actually, we spend most of our lives thinking we belong to a certain family or a religious group or to a profession, and we hold those identities. And those are important identities, but they're not a larger identity, and they're not an identity that's based on what's truly real, which might be the earth, actually, which fully sustains and supports everything. So that might be a bit of a background of what I mean by ego logic versus eco logic. In a sense, the way I use it is slightly similar to Bill. In some sense, most humans never really get to a place where they feel that they're belonging to the ecosystem. Actually, they might know it cognitively in terms of a hypothesis, but they don't have an experience or a culture that really supports that. So that their primary place of belonging and participation and maybe service is the greater watershed. That's really what brings them alive. It's not necessarily my profession or my career or my family or my religion. It's something much bigger than that. So for me, the ego is what's really limiting in a certain sense. It's an important thing to have a very mature ego and an ego that functions in the world and occasionally is transcended from time to time through meditation and other things. But it's not the whole show. And I think most people don't know that it's not the whole show. And there's a possibility that we can shift our consciousness into an ecocentric consciousness, where we sense that we're a part of something greater, which makes us greater, actually. And it doesn't make us smaller, it makes us a greater participant in the wild world. So that's kind of what I mean by that. And it's important for me just because I was raised and, as a scientist and a psychiatrist, almost all the developmental models limited everything to the ego, even Erik Erikson's model. The last stage is ego integration or despair. There's no mention of eco in any of it, or the natural world, or even soul, different things like that. So the way I was raised is the whole show is really the human ego, and it's not the whole show, it's part of the show. But it's really the more than human world and how we participate in it. So that's a bit of a background. It's also very similar to a lot of other philosophers and depth psychologists and deep ecologists, Leopold, Ness, Seed, Macy, Linda here, etc., Matthew Fox, all of them. We're talking about the same kind of thing. Yeah.
So I'm wondering, that's what you've described here in conjunction with your background in psychiatry. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing how you made that shift, because that's a pretty profound dichotomy there.
Yeah, good point. Well, let me go to a little background. When I was 21, I was sharing this with the three of the founders here and the speakers. I was trying to go into the wild whenever I could. I'd bring books of myth and poetry and novels in my backpack and maybe a fishing rod. And I'd just go out for 10 days at a time when I wasn't working. I didn't really know what I was doing. I just felt the call of the wild. And then I decided I have to do what everybody else does and get a good job, right? And I chose something I thought would be of service and still allow story to come into it, maybe a bit of nature. So I chose child psychiatry. Actually, I figured I can help kids in difficult circumstances find their true story, something like that. Well, that's not what medical school or psychiatric training is about at all. So when I finished my psychiatric training, I actually trained in Cape Town, South Africa, to understand how other cultures might look at psyche and ego. And then I started working where I didn't have to prescribe medication very much, which was perinatal and infant and early childhood psychiatry. And I loved that. And I was really successful and really good at it. And I got an endowed chair in psychiatry when I was 42. And about a week after that, a voice in the middle of the night said, "You're done." And I was like, oh, shit. This is what I thought I was here to do, right? So I took a bit of a sabbatical and I started going to the wild again. And then I did a program called a Men's Rite of Passage with Richard Rohr's group. It's now called a Lumen. And at the end of that, it was kind of powerful, even though it was in Texas and it was a bunch of Catholic men, and I wasn't Catholic. I was actually a Buddhist at that time. It was kind of powerful. And at the end of that, there was a list of things to do to further your masculine spiritual journey. And right in the middle of the page was this book, Soulcraft by Bill Plotkin. I downloaded it on my little e-reader, and by page 10, I pretty knew what the rest of my life was going to be. I knew that this is what I was really looking for when I was 21. So I did a program with them. About a week later, I had about 2 weeks left in my sabbatical. And on that program, it was in the canyons of southeastern Utah. It was called a Soulcraft Journey. And we did lots of different practices, and we had incredible dreams. It was amazing what happened to my dream life the moment I got out there. And then we had a bit of a solo, and I spent 24 hours in a tree, which I called a grandfather tree, because I didn't have good relationships with my grandfather. And in the middle of the night, I was either dreaming or having a vision. In the middle of the night, this woman, I'm not really sure what she was. I wasn't sure if she was an indigenous woman from that canyon or the Mother Earth herself, said, "Welcome home." And I burst into tears. Yeah, and that was for me a further eco-awakening of returning home to my primary place of belonging and participation in the imaginal and in the earth. And it really shifted me. And maybe I can shift a definition of eco-awakening now, because I'll share a little bit about it. So for me, it was a bit of a passage and a return where what I really understood was I wasn't really here to be a psychiatrist or a professor. I wasn't really here primarily to be a father or a partner. I was really here to participate in whatever magical thing I had just stepped back into. That I felt like I really belonged to Earth and to this canyon. And it began to shift that it wasn't really about me. It was really about the more than human world. It wasn't even about people. It was really about the others. I began to really sense and to feel somatically, I can even hear it in my voice, and maybe you can too, what was really happening in terms of global warming and species loss and what was happening in plastics in the oceans. I knew about those things before, but it didn't rock me to my core the way it did after that experience. So that was part of the eco-awakening. It was a somatic experience, very emotional, spiritual, and it wasn't necessarily just cognitive, which I think is maybe what's primary in our culture. People get the Gaia hypothesis, but they haven't had an experience like this. Let's see what else. I think the other thing that was important for me is that I didn't have any existential angst after that. I knew where I belonged, actually. I think I'd been in and out of that kind of from, I don't know, maybe childhood, of kind of moving through different identities. But once I knew I was really anchored to Earth and kind of planted in Earth, that kind of all went away, even though I was much more emotional about what was happening on the planet and in our culture. So that might be another component of it too. You feel less restless about where you belong, but you might feel and have the capacity to experience more emotions about what's happening for all the other species. So that's a little bit of my understanding of eco-awakening, and I do have a PowerPoint I'm happy to send to Carol, and she can send out that has a more lengthy description of that, slightly more technical, but it might be more interesting to have heard that one than the technical one. You kind of get the gist of what it feels like to go through this experience. And then I've witnessed that many times when I finished my training at Animas Valley and guided these fasts for people, that maybe a third of people on our programs come back with this experience that's undeniable about their participation and their belonging to Earth and the kind of conversations they had with the natural world. They're really broken open, and they really want to continue to move more deeply in service and participation with the Earth. So,
I think you come with in our field and in our interest group, so to speak, you come with a very an experience that we can relate to. I'm wondering though if you can speak to those people who haven't had that experience or are unable in some way. In other words, why isn't everyone eco-awakened?
that's a good question. I wonder if we could open it up to the group, maybe crowdsource the answer here. Is that okay? I'm just curious what other people think about it, whether they put it in the chat or unmute and share. Is that okay, Carol and Gabrielle? Yeah, why are we so lost even though we're right where we belong? Any ideas?
Well, I'll speak up and just share. I think it has to do with our society and our culture not focusing on our home.
Mm.
In my case, for example, I now live in the Netherlands, and I live near to some fields and some forests, and I go there every day. And since I started learning about ecopsychology even more aware of that. However, I grew up in Barcelona, right in the middle of the city. And I think that to me, it's hard to do this eco-awakening, or I'm getting into it, I hope so. And I think it's because I grew up in a city and also in a society that, I mean, my everyday life had very little nature in it, unfortunately.
Yeah. Maybe one more. Any other thoughts or ideas or?
I would say maybe lack of connection or exposure to nature early in life, like early childhood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think there's something about the way that we've unfortunately evolved in our uncivil civilizations that in some ways our culture is now designed so that you never find this, actually, because if you found this, you wouldn't participate in culture as it is further. So whether that's conscious or it's just the way it's evolved, it's part of my understanding. And I think part of it is that much of our civilization is really meant to create unhealthy individuals, actually, by getting you to leave the wild and go sit at a desk when you're 5 and do worksheets, right? This is why the Children in Nature Network and that movement is so important right now, is because most children, they know their natural belonging to it, actually. And many of us remember that when we were 4 or 5, what it was like. And you heard it in my voice maybe when I talked about my love of this mountain place. I just knew that that's what man was meant to be. This is the way it was meant to be. And that schooling was a bit odd, actually, and way too many words, actually, and way too lack of movement. And of course, people would say it's only your imagination and get over your emotions. All these things which are natural to us was suppressing that. So it's my understanding that, and Bill's understanding, the way he's kind of talked about it, is that this eco-awakening is actually an artifact of Western culture. Most indigenous people and people raised in nature-based cultures, they never lose their primary sense of belonging to the earth, actually. But we lose it because we go into some sort of cultural-based slumber. And it's partly because of our family lifestyles and our educational and religious systems and other cultural ways that really suppress our ability to, Bill would say, to cultivate the nature-based tasks of development. And maybe that's one of the important things that you were kind of talking about there, Deidre, is that in our understanding, and this is from Bill's book, Nature and the Human Soul, there are particular tasks of development. And unfortunately, in Western culture, we primarily know of and have studied and offer culture-based tasks, when in fact there's nature-based tasks. And that's why we feel so empty, and why indigenous people might call us white people gray people, because they know that we're missing something. And part of it is our exploration of cultivating relationship to the wild world without being taught what things are. But as children, just going exploring and wandering. The best thing that can happen for kids, is just gentle supervision from age like 4 to 8, where they're just exploring. They're getting to know it on their terms and participating and imagining that they're a butterfly or they're a cheetah, something like that. And then there's also, we're a pretty emotionally unintelligent culture too. We really suppress our negative emotions for sure, but we're also talk children out of their emotions frequently, out of their grief, out of their frustration. And also we don't really support exploration of our own bodies as children and delight in our bodies and movement and dance and all those kind of things and music. So those are some of the nature-based tasks of kind of the childhood years, which we give permission to on our different programs for people to return to. And it's amazing what happens when they begin to kind of re-inhabit their bodies and their connection with nature and their emotions or their imaginations, or just being present, like in a sit spot for many nature-based programs. A sit spot's an amazing place just to hold your attention without feeling like you have to answer an email or go look at your cell phone or something like that. So it's my understanding that what both of you said is that it's really inhibited in our culture by our culture itself, that our culture is not designed for you to understand that your primary place of belonging is Earth. And that's why we have to develop different methods. And the method we have at Animas is one developed for Western-based peoples. It's not culturally appropriated. We have to develop methods by which we can primarily return to this participation and this experience and this understanding. So I hope that answers the question, Gabrielle.
Well, it does, and it also brings up actually a question that a participant offered when they registered. And I think if we pull the lens out a little bit, kind of the elephant in the room might be the either the presence or lack thereof of privilege and diversity. So I wonder if you could speak to that aspect of this.
Yeah, huge conversation piece, and something that I wrestle in every organization I'm in. When I was a psychiatrist, I primarily served people of color, whether it was in Kailicha, South Africa, or Ghana, or in rural Louisiana, or inner city New Orleans, or in Aurora, Colorado. I rarely saw a white face, actually, except for another provider, because I really felt called to serve those who had less access. And then when I entered into kind of this wilderness rites of passage, whatever you want to call it, nature-based soul guiding work, it was surprising how white those cultures were and those circles were. So part of it is just a bit of privilege. Part of it is access to nature. You know, if you look at almost every study of inner cities, people of color have very little access to nature. And the more access they get, the better their development is, and whatever you want to call that in terms of health outcomes or mental health outcomes, different things like that. And then there's also maybe the optics of what it looks like. What would it look like for white people to guide people of color or indigenous people into the wild, where atrocities actually occurred when white people did that? And also there's certainly the fact that many of our cultures, we live in a bit of siloed cultures. And so part of it is, how do we meet people where they're at with the right language, with our unique tools that we might have in some of these different organizations, and also make it accessible, right? It's hard enough actually to be a healthy human in a Western culture, and our programs typically have required you take 5 days off from work. Well, a lot of people can't afford that. You know, they're working 2 or 3 jobs. So that's part of it. So part of the hope in a lot of the organizations I'm involved with is that we can take this and also find funding, and also find individuals from these other cultures or microcultures within our greater civilization who could actually be the guides, could be the culture guides, who could actually bring this work to different individuals. And we're actively involved in that across the board. But it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. Yeah.
Well, and on that note, let's pull the lens back then even further and bring in the non-human. How would you respond to, you know, the idea of then having the animal world, the non-human animal world be a lead, or the kind of immobile world of you know, plants, trees, all of that? How in what ways do they participate in more leadership roles?
Well, maybe one qualification I would want to say is some of the work that we're talking about, which is at Animas, we might call this some of the eco-awakening or wild mind work, is that it's not a therapy in a sense to make your symptoms any better. So it's also not like equine assisted therapy to help you get rid of anxiety or depression or anything like that. It's more about how do you cultivate aspects of your own human nature by which you can participate more fully in broader nature, however you want to language that. And for us, we use something called the nature-based map of the human psyche, which wasn't really something that came from Bill's mind. It's just something that he saw was happening for people on these programs in terms of what was opening up for them and what was happening for them in conversation with the land, and what was also limiting them. And so from one of the things that we like to do in our programs is we cultivate wholeness in the 4 windows of knowing. And I'll just go through those real quickly here. One is just kind of being present-centered and in your innocence, like an infant, but also just being fully present and available to sound and taste and touch and interoception and all of that. Another one is our embodied emotion, to really experience ourselves as a primary member of the earth community and to fully feel our emotions and wherever they live in our body. Another one is a window of knowing is the heart-centered thinking. And this is one that thinks about what the ancestors want and what the 7 generations forward need, that kind of thinking, not next quarterly profit statement, which is the way most of Western culture thinks. And then another aspects of our way of knowing, our window of knowing, is our through the deep imaginal, through deep dream and imaginal journeys and other altered states. we found that when we are able to cultivate these different windows of knowing, there's a sense of wholeness that comes. And when there's a sense of wholeness, there's a greater likelihood of an eco-awakening experience. Now to get back to your question. So that was a bit of a background. We don't cultivate wholeness or go on eco-awakening as a weekend retreat and to check it off the bucket list. That's not what this is about. And it's not even because it makes me feel better, although it does. Right? Most people, when they go to the nature, they feel much better, right? And there's plenty of data on that. Part of this work is so that once you cultivate your wholeness, you actually move, you shift your service beyond yourself and beyond your profession, and you move it to culture and also to the more than human world. So we don't necessarily include animals in our programs. They're just there. Whatever is available for conversation is there. On my fast, the main two creatures that offered them, well, maybe three, that wanted to be in conversation one was called a river bluet damselfly, who looked like a Zen monk, and we had a conversation for about 8 hours, actually. And another one was a short-leafed cactus. And that one I kept going back and back into conversation. It was a unique one because it had a full new body, but off its base was a husk of the former self, which mirrored what was happening for me. So to answer the question, at least as I understand it, is that it's about being in conversation with everything from all our nature within us to whatever wishes to be in conversation by asking permission and seeing what happens. Something like that. It's a type of sacred reciprocity from our wholeness. Yeah.
Well, on that, when you said asking permission, there's been some dialogue around, you know, the human capacity for projecting what we desire onto, you know, in those moments of asking permission, you know, what happens if the non-human creature says no thank you? Do you how do you address that that potential?
Yeah, respect it. I would say part of it is also saying, am I projecting that upon it so that I'm afraid of being in conversation? So part of it, it's a bit of a discernment. As a guide, I might ask a question of, did it say that? Or are you afraid to be in conversation or something like that?
Yeah, deep listening.
Yeah. I think another thing, one of the things Bill teaches in the training program is that the wrong way to go in nature is to look for oracles. Actually, it's to be curious about the others. When we're curious about the others and really participate and get to understand, at least from our little consciousness, of how their lives might be, something magical happens in that kind of participation. And occasionally something gets mirrored back.
I also want, this is kind of taking a different track, but in our conversation, you had brought up the element of the slowdown and the time that it takes to kind of, you know, reacclimate into the nature world or into the natural world, and the time frame that takes. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I'm sure right now, whoever's listening in from Homeland Security or Google or something on our conversation is like, can we create an app for this where it happens in 15 minutes? Right? Because our culture wants to get things done pronto, right? Because there's things to be done and money to be made, right? And I think that's part of the problem that we're in. And maybe this is it reminds me of that voluntary simplicity movement and about just slowing down, because what people end up doing in their lives is they end up speeding up so they can buy things in order to get enough time to have vacation, which is about slowing down, right? So one of the things I've noticed is that maybe we live on what we live at a technological pace. Actually, we used to live at an industrial pace, which was pretty fast. Now we live at a technological pace, which is even quicker. And there's so many modes of information coming to us from all different kinds of modes. And it's quite challenging to fully be present and to be fully in participation. And So a lot of people who come on our different programs or something like that, they might start with sit spots, and they find it really hard just to sit for 10 minutes in one particular place to pay attention because they're so used to doing something, and rather than just being present. In terms of this eco-awakening, it's a bit of a question. I mean, part of we don't know of how do we, it's kind of like ecotherapy, I would say, probably in a sense. The ecotherapy is probably a continuous improvement in one's ability to kind of participate in nature. And then there's this, not just continuous, it's a categorical shift, as you heard in my story. It's something radically shift, and we don't know exactly how much time that means or what particular things have to happen. But among wilderness rights guides, they would probably say that something like 3 days in is really important. There's something about this 3 days in. I actually think there's a video by Martin Shaw talking about this as well. There's something about just moving away from culture from 3 days and just having your senses be surrounded by that which is natural, that which is born, rather than that which is created by man. And that's my experience as well. And of course, our weekends in Western culture are not designed for 3 days, they're designed for 2. So they're just enough to make you feel better to go back and be doing what you were doing by participating in that technical industrial growth complex, if you still are. So I think there's something about extended time in nature, which is why in adolescence for sure, and and GAP programs, these are extended periods of time, right? They're really extended periods of time. Gap year programs are, anywhere from 3 to 12 months with a lot of time in nature. And other programs, a lot of these wilderness programs are up to a month. For me, it's you do what you can, actually. And again, this is a bit of privilege, again. The more time you can have in there and any possibility of getting at least 3 days in a semi-wild or wild space is incredibly beneficial. But it's also interesting to watch people, like sometimes when I've guided at retreat programs, how quickly people want to go back and check their cell phones or their email, even though they're at this. So we have a bit of an addiction to staying connected. But I'd say 3 days is a great thing to shoot for. And I wish that all adolescents could get at least 3 days as part of their high school by just being in the wild and being led by people who really understand what's possible. And all adults need it too.
Yeah. Too true, too true.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm wondering if we could open this up to our fellow participants for questions